about now? That sounds better. Yes. Okay. It's always a little bit of a challenge at the midweek service when everybody has been working hard and you work all day and you come here. And for me anyway, when I sit down, it's like all the tired from the day that couldn't catch up with me because I was moving too fast catches up. And so it's a challenge. I'll try to make enough noise and have enough energy tonight to keep everybody reasonably engaged. We're in Exodus chapter 12. I should say, first of all, I am not Brandon. I feel the need to say that for the nearsighted brethren. You might not be able to tell the difference from a distance, but Brandon is at Polishing the Pulpit, I believe, this week, and actually teaching some classes there. So he's not on vacation from this class. I think he'll be doing more teaching this week than he does in a normal week. We're talking about Exodus, and he left me chapter 12. I've stepped in for Brandon a few times over the last year or so, and it's always something interesting. Now, it may be because he's teaching Bible classes, and everything is interesting if you approach it correctly. But I've found that the last couple of times that I've substituted for Brandon in a class, it's been something that I found really fascinating, and that's going to be the case tonight as we study Exodus chapter 12. Before we begin, let's ask the Lord to bless our study. Our dear Father in heaven, we thank you for the beautiful day that you have given us on this beautiful earth. We thank you, Lord, for the reminders that we see everywhere around us of your greatness, of your glory, your power, and your love. We thank you, Lord, for revealing that power to us not only in nature, but in your word. We thank you for telling us in that word what has happened in the past to make our salvation possible and how that we can take advantage of that salvation. We pray that you, Lord, you will help us to be interested, ready students who are looking to learn everything that we can from your word and to become better servants because of it. This we pray in your Son's name. Amen. Okay. So Exodus chapter 12. I call this the founding of Israel. When I think about when Israel actually came into being as a nation, there's probably a lot of times and places that you could point at and make a good argument as to this was when the nation of Israel started. One that you could particularly point at is the giving of the law at Sinai. That's a pretty good one, and that's probably what I would have said before I started thinking about this. But in studying for this class, it occurred to me that when they together in the land of Egypt participated in the Passover, that was when they became a nation. They all were together obeying God, following his word, his law, and that was, to me, the point at which they became the nation of the kingdom of God, rather than merely a group of people living in the same place who had the same ancestry or similar ancestry. So thus the name, the founding of Israel. We're going to talk about the Passover, the original, the first one, the real first Passover, and what it means and what it meant in the context of this of the narrative we're studying in Exodus, and a little bit about what it might mean more generally as well. If I can get there. Exodus chapter 12. And let me start with the first 6 verses. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to the house, take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. So this is a very interesting passage, and nothing like what had happened before. Before this point, what we've seen in this book in Exodus was, first of all, the oppression of the Israelites, followed by the call of Moses, followed by his repeated encounters with Pharaoh and the 9 plagues. So we know that there's one plague left to go, and there's a pretty significant prelude to that plague. The Lord just does not just go through Egypt and kill all the firstborn. He puts some. He wants his people to participate. He gives them something to do and gives them a time of preparation for this. This is a big event. So he gives some initial instructions to Moses about the observance of the Passover. And he says, first of all, this is your first month. This is where your year begins, right here in this month, which I believe at the time was called Abib, or referred to a lot as the earing month. This is when the barley ears, I believe, came onto the grain, when it began to be ripe. It was later, after the exile, the Israelites, when they came back from Babylon, they brought Babylonian names for their months. So this became Nisan, or I'm not sure how to say it. But it was the first month. Now the interesting thing there are a couple of interesting things. I don't want to get too detailed into this, but in studying this, I got a little bit confused about what was going on, so I started reading about the calendar a little bit, and that is a good way to get more confused. So, if you go looking through, accounts of Jewish holidays, you'll find Rosh Hashanah is sort of the New Year celebration, and you know when it is? It's in the 7th month. That is a very unique place to put New Year's Day, and halfway through the year. But the way of looking at it apparently is this is sort of the holy or the religious year beginning here, but they also had a sort of a civil year, and that would be the one commemorated in the 7th month. Much like our New Year's Day is January 1st, but here in a couple of weeks, in actually 10 days, I guess, the place where I work will begin its fiscal year. We can start years at different points for different purposes, and fiscal years often start July 1st. Ours starts September 1st. In Israel, the religious year started in Abib, and the civic year started, it seems, in the 7th month. So, in case you run across a reference to Rosh Hashanah being nowhere near the Passover, that would be the reason. The other thing to remember about the calendar in Egypt, in Israel, is that they used a lunar calendar. In other words, they went by the phases of the moon. One cycle of the moon was a month. 12 cycles of the moon is a year. Of course, you may notice that the moon does not go through a complete number of cycles in the same time that the earth goes around the sun. A solar year is about 10 or 11 days longer than a lunar year. And so each year, you go through each lunar year, you'll fall behind a little bit of the solar year. So in Israel, if the Passover was supposed to be about the time of the barley harvest, which it was, it's going to be if it's right on one year, the next year it's going to come in about 10 or 11 days short. And then the next year it's going to lose another 10 or 11 days. And after a few years, it's going to be nowhere near the harvest or the spring. So Jewish calendars have traditionally added a month. It's like we add a leap year. Our leap year is 1 day because we use a solar calendar, and it only comes off about a quarter day off in a year. So every 4 years or so, we add a year. We add a day. Adding a year would really screw things up. The Jewish calendar, they would add a month every so often. It was not necessarily set in stone as to how often that would be. In the times of about the New Testament we're reading, the Sanhedrin would actually observe the weather and the conditions and determine if they had gotten too far off and needed to make an adjustment. Now I believe they have a pretty set schedule for doing that, and it involves about every 2 to 3 years they'll add a month. So it comes out to 7 months, 7 times in 19 years. There'll be a month added to the Jewish calendar to force the beginning of the month back into the spring. But that was maybe too much of a digression. The beginning of months, though, is going to be now. You're going to start numbering your year today. And on the 10th day of this month, you're going to do something. You're going to go choose a lamb. Why do you suppose it was on the 10th day and not, say, the first day? I'm not sure about that myself. Maybe the number 10 is a representative of the 10 plagues. And that was to be the 10th plague, which would be commemorated somewhat by the Passover. Or maybe, there could be another reason. Maybe he wanted them to start the month right now, but they needed 10 days to prepare to do what he wanted them to do. But in any event, on the 10th of the month, they were to select a lamb. And of course, it shouldn't surprise us that the lamb was to be spotless. It was to be in every way perfect, and a male of a year old. Moses, I'm sure, does not know yet what this is going to be for, but he knows that it's going to be an important occasion that everybody in Israel has to get a lamb. And so they select the lamb, a sheep or a goat. This is something that I've read before, and I thought, well, that's interesting. It could be a sheep or a goat. And then 30 seconds later, it has left my mind completely, and every time I read it, it seems to be a surprise. But I did think about it a little bit more this time, and it's just still interesting to me that we think about the Passover always as being associated with sheep. And there's some indication, some scholars suggest that the implication anyway is that it should be a sheep if you had sheep. And if you had no sheep, then you could use a goat. Or perhaps if you had a small number of sheep and there were none that met the criteria of a male a year old that was flawless, well, then you could go to the goats. But some people think that the sheep was preferred if possible. But it's a male of a year old that is flawless to be the object or to be the sacrifice. And it was to be kept until the 14th day, which was another curious thing. For one reason, why is there a delay at all? And the second reason, why does it have to be 4 days? Now, that's something else that Moses does not tell us about. He just tells us what he did. We can make some. We can suggest a few things. We'll never know for sure if we're right, but we might have some interesting thoughts. So, anybody have any thoughts? Yes. Okay, so possibly it was 4 days in order to become attached to the lamb, and so that it would be a true sacrifice when it was killed. It's a possibility. And I've read some things that were somewhat along that lines, similar to it. Does anybody else have a thought? There are a couple of things that people have suggested. One of them being that the 4 days represented the 4 centuries that Israel had been in bondage. that's not the most popular idea. I mean, it certainly, there are more people who dislike that than like it, it seems, but it certainly has some possibility in it. The thing that seems to be maybe preferred more than others is similar to what she just said. It's that you had 4 days in order to be around this animal and to consider its holiness. The fact this thing was something that was dedicated to God, that was holy for you, that was pure and spotless, and you had 4 days to contemplate the value and the magnitude of what was going to happen on the 14th of the month, and that was the sacrifice of the lamb. You're to take one per family, with the exception that if the family was too small to eat a lamb, then you could combine households for the purpose of the lamb. There was no set number on how many people there should be for one lamb, but I think at some point in history, the rabbis decided that 10 was a good number, was the preferred number, 10 people per lamb. But that was never recorded. That's not what God told Moses. He just said, you sort of have to use your own judgment on this. But if you have 2 people and a big lamb, that's too much lamb for the people, for the household. So you could use your head and a little common sense and figure out that a household of 2 people and a household of 4 people, they should probably get together, and maybe even another 2 people. But it was 1 per family with only that exception. And on the evening of the 14th, it was to be killed. If you read a few different translations, you might see something like killed between the evenings. I think what we read here was twilight, which is as good as any. If you read between the evenings, which I think is close to a literal translation of what it says, you have to think, okay, is that between the evening of the 14th or the evening of the 15th? Or is there something else that we're missing? What it seems to be is that they had 2 ideas of evening. One is when the sun disappears behind the horizon. That's evening. The second one is basically when it gets dark. That's the second evening, or the second idea of evening. So somewhere between sunset and dark, you are supposed to sacrifice the lamb. So twilight is as good a one-word rendering of that idea as anything. But so there's specific instructions here. Okay, you take a lamb, it has to meet these criteria. You have to keep it for 4 days, and then you have to make sure that you have a suitable number of people for the consumption of this lamb, and then you kill it at around this time, pretty close to this time. The instructions are not exact, but they are fairly, they're not broad either. So on the evening of the 14th, you kill the lamb and engage in the Passover. 7 through 11 now. More detail. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roast it in fire, its head and its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So he says, okay, now this is what you're going to do once you kill the lamb. Now, on the evening of the 14th, you will find yourself in possession of a dead lamb. What do you do then? Well, first of all, the blood goes on the doorposts. I mean, that's the first thing. Once you have killed the lamb, blood on the doorpost and the lintel. This is an emphasis. So, okay, before you do anything else, it seems to be saying, make sure you get this part right, because this is important. And you'll see later why it's important. Once you have blood from a lamb from a suitable lamb, it needs to go on those doorposts. And then the feast. It's a description of how to eat it, and you eat it roasted in fire. Not boiled or not raw, certainly, but you roast it like this, the whole lamb pretty much, and then you eat it. And you shall let none of it remain until morning. Let me make sure I hit the part about the unleavened bread. They were to eat it with unleavened bread. We know, we understand why that is. They may not have. You never do when things are going on, and we have the benefit of 3,500 years of hindsight to know why all this is happening. But they were not going to have time for the next few days. They were not going to be able to make leavened bread because they were going to be in too big a hurry to get out of Egypt. And this is sort of a signification of that, the fact that we're traveling. We're moving now. We don't have time to stop and put leaven in our bread and wait for it to rise. This and the fact that they were to be prepared to travel. This is sort of an indication of faith to me. Have you ever heard, I'm sure you have heard the story actually, about the preacher whose congregation had assembled to pray for rain. It was a terrible drought, and they were praying for rain, and the preacher said, well, where are your umbrellas? Well, you're praying for, you want it to rain, yet nobody seems to think it's going to, because nobody bothered to bring an umbrella. Maybe a similar thing. You're appealing to God in worship for your release from the Egyptian bondage, and you should be prepared to head out at a moment's notice if you're going to do that, because the Lord will hear your prayers, and He will answer your promise, and He will give you what you have asked. And when He does, you better be prepared to take it. Now, there are also bitter herbs, which it doesn't say exactly why. Usually we take it to represent the bitterness of their bondage. And the word bitter is used for their servitude in Egypt at least once, maybe once and twice. So that's a pretty reasonable, I think a pretty reasonable interpretation. Other people have just pointed out that, some bitter herbs actually accompany lamb pretty well. It's they go together well. I'm not sure why that would be commanded for that purpose, but it does make the whole a more, I'm not sure, more pleasing. It makes the participation a more pleasing and not itself an onerous thing by having everything go together well. But none of it is to be left until morning. And if it is left, you have to burn it. Now, why would that be? Partly. Yeah. True. But why would you not just pick it up and use it for lunch later that day or something? True. That's part of it. They may have left a little while. I have my own idea about this. So over in Exodus chapter 29, I should say it's not my own idea. It's something that I came across in studying for this, so I cannot take credit for it. Exodus 29:34. We're talking about the ram of consecration for the priests. And it says in verse 34, if any of the flesh of the consecration offerings or of the bread remains until the morning, then you shall burn the remainder with fire. It shall not be eaten because it is holy. You're not to eat it. You're not to eat the holy meat from the offering in a casual or a manner or event. So you don't snack on the Passover lamb. You don't eat it for breakfast, or you don't make a sandwich out of it. Not that they could have made a sandwich then, but You don't. It is holy. Maybe for the same reason they were told to keep the lamb for 4 days beforehand, they are not to treat anything left from that or anything that they eat in a manner that is not in keeping with the holiness of the sacrifice and of the occasion. So if you don't eat it all, you burn it. But nothing about this observance is to be treated in a casual or vulgar manner. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. These are instructions, and yes, even now we have trouble with that. We have a lot of history to tell us to do that, and we still struggle with it. But it is the Lord's Passover. This is an emphasis at the end of this about why you should follow these instructions and why you should treat it as holy and respectful. It's the Lord's Passover. It's not your idea. You're not doing this for yourself. You're doing this because the Lord has given it to you. It is a commemoration of the blessing that you're about to receive. So don't treat it casually. Continuing in verse 12. If there was any doubt about why they're doing these things, God, in talking to Moses now, makes it clear what all this means. It is the Lord's Passover, beginning at the end of verse 11. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So God says, it's the Passover because I will pass not over, but through. I will go through Egypt and I will strike the firstborn. So he's going to be among the Egyptians and causing havoc, striking the firstborn of his enemies essentially, and destroying them. The implication here is that, well, let me save that for a moment. So it's striking of the firstborn. And the blood on the doorpost will be a sign. God will see the doorpost and he will pass over. So on the one hand, he will pass through the Egyptians. And on the other hand, he'll pass over the Israelites when he sees the blood. Now, here's a dumb question, but I just want to ask it for, I guess, rhetorical purposes. But did God need to see the blood to know who lived in the house? I think, yeah. No, not really. I think God was pretty well knew who lived where and who was his. And yes, B. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Obedience. This is something you see throughout the entire Bible. Obedience does not accomplish salvation, but obedience is necessary. You must be a participant in your own salvation, even if you can't bring it about yourself. You have to at least cooperate with God when he wants to save you. He will not save you against your will. So they were God's people essentially because they put the blood on the door. That's what made them, that's what put them in this relationship with God in which he was going to pass over them. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's something interesting to think about here, is that this is called the Passover. And this is the day, of course, when God achieved final victory and complete victory over Egypt. Well, maybe completed shortly after in the river, in the Nile, but this was where God triumphed. If we had a day like this, we had 2 days in 1945. Well, and they're still commemorated to some extent, but there were 2 days set up in 1945 as commemorations of great victories. And what were those days called? VE and VJ Day. If we were in charge of setting up the commemoration, there would be a VE Day. This is what it would be called, Victory in Egypt. It would be all about victory and overcoming of the foes. Or it might be the celebration of the Exodus, how we are going to commemorate the great triumph of leaving Egypt. And they certainly did those things to some extent, but this is called the Passover. What they're commemorating is not so much God destroying the Egyptians or God delivering the Israelites. They're commemorating God passing over the Israelites. Basically, the implication is, I should point out, I think I have that here. Yes, Kurtz, who wrote this book, Offering Sacrifices and Worship in the Old Testament, which I've used as a reference for some of this. It's on a level that I can't quite get to, but some things I was able to get out of it. And he says, Passover is really step over. Like if you don't want to step on something, if you have a small pet and decides to take a nap in the middle of the walkway, well, if you're not feeling mean, you step over it. Whereas if there's something that you do want to step on, some ants or some other noxious thing, well, then you don't step over, you step on. So God is stepping over the Israelites. The implication is, if you're not being stepped over, then you're being stepped on. Isaiah 63:6. There's a few passages like this in the Bible that speak this way. But Isaiah 63:6 is one I wanted to use to emphasize or illustrate that. He writes, I have trodden down the peoples in my anger, made them drunk in my fury, and brought down their strength to the earth, which is pretty much exactly what's happening here. He says, I have trodden down the peoples in my fury. There's another reference to God just stepping on his enemies. So the Israelites, what they're commemorating in the Passover seems to me to be just as much, if not more, the fact that God did not strike them. That they were delivered not so much from the Egyptians as from the wrath of God because of the blood upon the doorposts. They were saved. The differences between what made the difference between the enemies of God and his friends or his people was the blood of that Paschal lamb upon the doorpost. Among the scholars, there's a lot of talk about what exactly the Passover meant, what it is. Is it a sacrifice? Was it really made to God? Or is it merely a ceremony that the people perform themselves? And the argument that seemed to be the winning one to me anyway, was that it is a sacrifice. The Passover is sacrifice to God, and the fact that they burned the meat is in keeping with that idea of it's holy because it is dedicated to God. And the blood on the doorposts is in some degree similar to the blood that was placed upon the altar. At least for the moment, they suggest. These homes where the Israelites lived were sanctified as altars, and there they made this offering to the Lord. And because of the blood of the Passover lamb, they were spared from God's wrath. So they were, it seems to me, at least as worthy of God's wrath as the Egyptians for different reasons. But they were spared because God allowed them to have the ability to to worship him and serve him in such a way and to obey him so that he did not strike them when he struck the Egyptians. I think obviously there's a lot of parallels between the Passover and the salvation in the New Testament. Quite a lot. So this is it's what I've been thinking about as I go through this, is the Israelites, the real threat, the real thing that they needed salvation from, and which we need salvation from, is not any earthly power or any earthly circumstance. It is the wrath of God for sin. Anyway, moving on a little bit. So 14 through 20 is sort of an interlude. God has told Moses what to do for this one day and how to do it. And then in 14, he makes sure they know that I guess you better remember this, because you're going to want to remember how you did it. You're going to want to remember this day. And you're going to commemorate this day, every year. Verse 14, so this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats unleavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which every one must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. Whether he is a stranger or a native of the land, you shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. So this is the instructions for in perpetuity. You will keep this feast. And he adds a dimension, because we've been talking about the Passover on the 14th, and now God says, for the whole week you will not eat leaven. You will have nothing to do with leaven at all. Nothing that has leaven, nothing made with leaven. You can't even have it in the house. Now, there's also some disagreement about what the purpose of that is. For instance, you'll see here in a minute, if we get to it, I'm not going to cover anywhere near what I wanted to, but when they left, they had to take their kneading bowls with unleavened dough, basically, and tie it up in their garments and run. Basically, they had to leave quickly. So they ate unleavened bread for quite a while, if not a week. Certainly, maybe it may have been a little less than a week, or it may have been longer before they had a chance to settle down and make bread properly, or what they would have called properly. So some people might say the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a commemoration of the traveling and of the eating of unleavened bread. So it is essentially of the Exodus. I have seen it also argued that the entire week, beginning with the Passover and continuing through the Feast of Unleavened Bread, was itself a commemoration of the one thing that the Passover is a commemoration of, and that is that day, that one day when God struck the Egyptians and passed over the Israelites. Certainly the events are tied together so closely you can't very well separate them. There's also some debate about whether there was 7 days of unleavened bread or 8 days, as whether there was one day of the Passover followed by 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or if in fact the Passover was really the first day of that 7 days, which is kind of what it looks like in verse 18. But the point of it was, there was a week-long remembrance of what was happening here. Every year they were to eat unleavened bread for a week. Everlasting. For all their generations, they were to keep this feast. And if they didn't, if anyone in Israel, even if they were not an Israelite, disobeyed that ordinance, they were to be put to death. 21 and 28. I'm not going to get very much further, but in 21, Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning." So hyssop is, no one is completely certain as to what kind of tree it referred to at this time, but it was something that would, with a rough bloom or leaf, or which you could take a bunch of and use it as basically a scrub, like a brush. You could scrub things with it, and you could, that's at least what I gather. And so you were to take it and dip it and just strike it, not sprinkle but strike. You were to emphatically put that blood on the doorpost and the lintels. Hyssop seems to always have the implication of ritual cleansing, as it is in Leviticus chapter 14. Also, David refers to it sort of figuratively in Psalm 51, "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean." So this is how it's going to be observed in the Promised Land, not just in Egypt or in the wilderness, but in the Promised Land. It was to be a tradition handed down from one generation to the next, not just a tradition, but they were to make sure that the children were told why it's happening. And the other interesting thing about it is, as far as I could tell, obviously the Bible doesn't tell us everything, it appears that the Israelites were 100% compliant. I made a note about Numbers 15, when there's a Sabbath day and somebody on that Sabbath day went around picking up sticks in violation of the Sabbath, doing some work, and they were cut off. It was a death penalty. The Bible told us about that. Doesn't tell us about anybody failing to observe this, as far as I could tell. So it seems to have been 100% compliance, and there I believe we have to stop. So thank you all.